So this year, Angela and I are focusing on some religious words which you struggle with sometimes. We've had God and redemption, and you'll hear about grace later in the year, for instance, and today we have atonement, which is a really important word for Unitarian Universalists because it's the crux of our disagreement with Christians. And today's message is that Judaism uses the word in a different and much more, in a way that we might find much more useful to us. In Christianity, you may know, the doctrine of the atonement teaches that ever since Adam and Eve had that apple in the Garden of Eden, all humanity is tainted with sin. And this is such a heavy thing in the scales of justice that the only way to make up for it was for God himself to come to earth and be sacrificed on the cross, and that's what's meant by Jesus died for your sins. And from the very beginnings of Unitarian Universalism, we have rejected the doctrine of atonement. The Unitarians, 18th and early 19th century Unitarians, tended to doubt that people were quite as sinful as Christianity, especially the kind of Calvinist kind of Christianity that they encountered in New England, were charging. Buoyed by the fresh waters of the Enlightenment and considerable recent progress in human culture and knowledge, the Unitarians believed that human beings were, well, like the old bumper sticker said, born okay the first time. Not in need of such a big, heavy thing as atonement. They felt that we certainly needed education and we needed formation in self-discipline and goodness and that sort of thing, but we didn't need God himself to come die for us. That just was unnecessary. And therefore, it was not necessary for Jesus to be God because Jesus could simply be a teacher who would teach us how to live this wise and wonderful life that we were meant to live. So the Unitarians believed that Jesus was an ordinary human being, and for this, they were given the name Unitarians by the Trinitarian majority. They preferred to call themselves liberal Christians at first. They lost the PR battle on that one, and possibly just as well, because by the end of the 19th century and early 20th century, many and then most Unitarians pretty much gave up on Christianity altogether and didn't think of themselves as liberal Christians anymore. Most Unitarians. The Universalists, on the other side, they were a more earthy bunch, and they weren't quite as sunny about human nature as the Unitarians. They saw the reality of human sin and guilt. But what they believed was that God loved all his children. God just was like a good parent, and just like us as good parents, no matter how wayward our children, we still want them back. We still try and guide them and help them and love them. And they enthusiastically quoted Jesus in saying that we should forgive our enemies 70 times 7, and they suggested that God would probably be practicing what Jesus was preaching in 70 times 7, so that he would continue to forgive us. And so the Universalists believed in universal salvation. Nobody was going to go to hell in the long run because God would forgive everything that needed to be forgiven. So, therefore, they too didn't need a doctrine of atonement, and for them, Jesus was also an extraordinary teacher and a very important person to be learning from, but didn't need to be God. And both groups, especially the Universalists, really felt the sting of being in the minority in the culture. And because of that, they came to believe in freedom of belief as much as those original ideas that they had had. They became non-creedal faiths, valuing the freedom of belief and expression, the freedom to grow, and for people to change what they believe above all those cozy feelings that you might have if you knew everybody in church believed exactly what you did. They gave that up. We gave that up. Most Universalists did consider themselves liberal Christians, but that non-creedal, we allow people to grow in their own sweet way, was enough to get the two denominations together in the 1960s, and we became Unitarian Universalists. This church, by the way, there was a vote on that merger. This church voted against that merger. Nobody remembers why, but they did. And therefore we never changed our name. So we're still the First Unitarian Church, but we belong to the Unitarian Universalist Association. So all in all, Unitarian Universalists have a pretty negative relationship to the doctrine of atonement. But, atonement is one of those very useful words which are worth reconsidering and finding a way to define so that it works for us. And we only have to look to our Jewish neighbors to find considerable wisdom about guilt, sin, and atonement, or as they sometimes say, AtOneMent. Jews don't talk about sin the way Christians do, and they utterly reject the notion of original sin. In Jewish thought, if God made it, it's good, and that includes all of us, even the most wayward of us, who are seen as having a core of goodness which has somehow gotten overshadowed in the course of events and choices. Jews tend to talk about sin as missing the mark rather than being some heavy inner part of us. It's just gone wrong today. And therefore they think of atonement not so much as not at all as a doctrine, but rather as a goal. At its deepest, that feeling of connection, acceptance, love of ourselves and other, feeling loved by God, feeling at one with everything. And that is a wonderful experience, which in the end lots of us have had in one way or another. It's an amazing grace. It often comes in or after hard times or struggle times, times in which we felt estranged from ourselves, our values, those around us, God. And AtOneMent is the peace that comes when we've worked through that estrangement. It's the peace that passes understanding. This feeling, it does seem to be a universal human feeling. It happens to people who go to church and people who don't, people who describe it with religious language and those who don't, people in all circumstances of life. Martin Luther King described it in a dream of being on a mountaintop soon before he died. Theologian Paul Tillich wrote about it as the feeling that comes from a source that you do not know, but which simply tells you, you are accepted. Some people call these experiences unitive experiences, unitive as in unity, meaning that they're often characterized by a kind of sense of boundarylessness and oneness with everything. Some kinds of peak experiences have this quality. They all seem to be ways of describing the same, probably universal human experience of AtOneMent. The 19th century religious philosopher William James wrote about this kind of spiritual experience. He commented that people who have them in all kinds of contexts, religious and not, but they report a lot of similarities, one of which is that they're hard to describe, these experiences. There's really just don't quite have words for them. Another is that the person who has them often has a realization about life that changes things for them. They come unexpectedly. They often don't come in a religious context. Even when they come to religious people, they often come in nature. They can't be forced by any spiritual disciplines. No matter how hard you try to get it back, it doesn't come back just because you want it back. They always fade away. They're also very easy to forget. And that's probably because what we can't put into words is hard for our brains to remember. James attached no particular theology or denomination to his description of this kind of experience, but most religious people would say that it's an experience of God's love or of the spirit world. But non-theists also experience AtOneMent. Buddhists, who believe that we all live in a world of illusions, see this as a fleeting gift of insight into how things really are. Humanists see them as purely psychological experiences, a part of the wonder of being human, and those who think scientifically point out that science is beginning to find this apprehension of unity and purpose in its disciplines. And how you name and explain these experiences not nearly as important is how you pay attention to them and incorporate them into your understanding of life. So maybe something like this has happened to you once. You've got a bunch of really pressing problems. And you've tied yourself up into knots of anxiety, and desperate for relief, perspective, and a change of view, you take yourself to a large park to take a walk. And you stump along for an hour talking to yourself, rehearsing your options, your anxieties, your worries, your angers, your fears. And finally, you wear yourself out, drop into an exhausted inner silence. You mount the crest of a hill and you see down the pathways, close enough that you can see their eyes, a group of deer. And you come to a startled halt. And for one moment, every fiber of your being is just present in the moment, in the place, with the deer. They look at you, you look at them. A smile plays on your lips, maybe the first smile in a while. And a weight drops from your shoulders. And you watch and wonder, feeling somehow deeply related to the deer and their peaceful ways. The deer amble off. You resume your walk, but it's different now. The weight is gone, the anxiety, the anger. You find yourself thinking, this is going to be all right. Whatever happens, this is going to be all right. There's no logical reason for you to think this. Of course, your problems are just as dire now as they were an hour ago, but you don't have any doubt about this larger wisdom. So the most important part of your problem, which is your reactivity and your anger about your problem, has changed. And you are content simply to do what needs to be done and await the outcome. You might have a similar experience while confronting yourself with your addictions or really realizing how deeply you have hurt someone you loved. You might have it as a health crisis resolves itself after days or weeks of anxiety and treatment, and you find yourself simply sitting in the sun, feeling better, healing, and at peace. You might have it after a tearful reconciliation, or when you find that in spite of whatever you've done, they seem to love you anyway. The genius of the Jewish religious practice is this 10-day period each year in which Jews are asked to dig deeply into the reality of their lives, to be honest with those they love, to ask forgiveness for transgressions and accept forgiveness from others, to resolve strains in relationships, and also to be honest with themselves and with the divine about who they really are, as humbling an experience as that usually is, and how they've missed the mark this year as individuals, as a people. And to sit with that a good long time, not to wallow in it, but to let it settle. And while it settles, to be reminded of the brevity and the preciousness of life, and the strengths and the beauty which are a part of every single human being. And to come and feel that sense of love and acceptance or peace, which is AtOneMent. Try it with me in this bit of time we have left. Remember what we confessed in the meditation together, that we've kept silent when we should have spoken up, that we have indulged in despair, that we have neglected to learn, that we've withheld our love, given meagerly, missed the mark, arrogant, brutal, careless, destructive. It's all a part of the shadow of our lives. On Yom Kippur, as the poet says, you're asked to stand. Why don't you do that if you're able? Stand up as good Jews would. Stand up to pray. You are asked to stand and bow your head. Consider the harm you've caused, the respect you've withheld, the anger misspent, the fear spread, the earnestness displayed in the service of prestige and sensibility, all the callous, cruel, stubborn, joyless sins in your alphabet of woe, so that you might be forgiven. You are asked to believe in the spark of your divinity, in the purity of the words of your mouth, and the memories of your heart. You are asked to forgive the past and remember the dead. To believe that no matter what you have done to yourself and others, morning will come and the mountain of night will fade. To believe for these few precious moments in the utter sweetness of your life. You are asked to bow your head and remain standing and say, Amen. Please be seated.